Pilgrimage to Spanish America by Everett Gill, Jr. Chapter 4 Over Andean Heights. Travelers who take the plane from Cali, Colombia to Quito, Ecuador, cross the equator. While flying high above the peaks of the Andes, the pilot dips a wing in simple salute, and you are down under. A simple experience, quite different from the blusterous ceremony on ocean vessels. Some will recall that the first white man to cross the equator in this part of the world was Bartolome Rules, pilot for the conquering Pizarro, who sailed his frail vessel southward from Panama in 1509. The Republic of Ecuador. Ecuador, a country larger than France, is named for the equator, which slices across its northern section. Back of the fertile plain that extends along the Pacific coast rise the giant crags of the Andes. In the east, the land tumbles precipitously from these heights to the headwaters of the Amazon. Most of Ecuador's 3 million inhabitants live on a high, healthful plateau in the Andes. Among the volcanic mountains that surround the plateau, Cotopaxi, the highest active volcano in the world, rears its hoary head 19,000 feet heavenward. From Ecuador are exported the famed Panama hats. In this country, the Spanish invaders first tasted the Irish potato. From Ecuador's thousands of cinchona trees is secured the quinine to quiet fevered patients around the world. The last chocolate you tasted probably came from Ecuador's cacao beans, which not long since they were drying in the streets of Guayaquil, where barefooted men tramped them to hasten the drying process. In Ecuador's mountain fastness, enormous deposits of gold, copper, and iron wait to be extracted. Before the Spanish conquest, Ecuador was a part of the Inca Empire, which extended from southern Colombia to northern Argentina. During colonial days, it was the seat of a high court of the Spanish administration under the general supervision of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Centuries of colonial isolation came to an end in 1822 with the decisive Battle of Pichincha, in which General Sucre's armies defeated the Spanish. After turbulent years of political unrest, with the Catholic, conservative, and the liberal, freedom-loving parties struggling for dominance. Well, freedom isn't about dominance over the other group. Ecuador today is moving forward. In spite of a strongly entrenched Roman Catholic Church, the door is open for the gospel, and the opportunities are overwhelming. Until international plane service was established, Guayaquil was the port of entry for all visitors to Ecuador, and 85% of her international commerce is still carried on here. On the banks of the mighty Guayas River, 3 miles wide at its mouth, Guayaquil was a pest hole of yellow fever and cholera until Dr. William C. Gorgas and his medical staff repeated the feat that made possible the building of the Panama Canal. In spite of its equatorial climate, the city is today free from epidemic disease. As in most tropical cities, life in Guayaquil begins early in the morning, before the heat has driven people to the cool recesses of their homes. In lovely arcades along the riverfront, shops of every variety display their wares, raw meat hanging in the open, ship rope piled high, gunny sacks bulging with corn and beans. Boys pass by with baskets of crabs, expertly balanced on their heads. A noble statue honors an Indian chieftain and his wife, who committed suicide as the invading Spaniards attacked. Another monument commemorates the famed conference in Guayaquil between General Bolivar and General San Martin, whose united military exploits and steel-like determination brought freedom to 7 Southern American countries. The two liberators, in sculpted marble, stand before a semicircular colonnade, flanked by panels on which are inscribed the names of battles familiar to every South American schoolboy: Boyaca, Carabobo, Pichincha, and Ayacucho. The university in Guayaquil, founded in 1867, is somewhat of Ecuador's struggle to free itself from its medieval past. On its campus are busts of Darwin, who visited the Galapagos Islands in 1835, and of Juan Montalvo, Ecuador's noted literary figure, in sharp contrast with the higher education offered by the university is the high rate of illiteracy that prevails throughout the country. A promising evangelical mission has been conducted in Guayaquil for years by the Christian and Missionary Alliance, but only a fraction of the city's 180,000 inhabitants have been reached with the gospel. Here are possibilities for establishing the Baptist faith with a probable response similar to that obtained in the north coastal region of Colombia, about 175 air miles northeast of Guayaquil. Gracious, Quito, Ecuador's capital, at an elevation of more than 9,000 feet above sea level, rests at the base of Mount Pichincha. Before the days of modern transportation, the journey from Guayaquil to Quito required 2 weeks. The 281-mile trip by train has been called one of the most exciting in the world. The twisting railroad, finished by Colonel John Harmon of Virginia and his crew of valiant men after 12 agonizing years, spans deep gorges, climbs through 11,000-foot Palmyra Pass, and twists back and forth as it climbs the famous Devil's Nose from the tropical heat of Guayaquil. The traveler to Quito alights in a city where 150,000 people live in spring-like atmosphere only a few miles from the equator. Now, if you know any of the updated figures or facts, please comment. In Quito, one feels both the charm and the stifling atmosphere of old colonial Spain, mingled with the progressive spirit of modern America. The city's 57 churches and monasteries tell of the former power of Catholic Spain. Throughout Ecuador, dispirited and disenfranchised remnants of the once proud Quicha Indians throng the roads and marketplaces. Wearing bright red ponchos, white hats, and white trousers, they form a strange contrast to the tourists, who alight from incoming planes. Men, women, and little children bend forward as they trudge under weary loads, chewing the coca leaf from which cocaine is extracted to gain temporary strength. Wretched, ignorant, and diseased, they live in rows of adobe hovels. At the close of the day, they sit before their squalid huts and play sad, plaintive tunes on their rondadores, strange reed-like instruments resembling the pipes of Pan, waiting in vain for a deliverer. That's implying a lot of stuff, isn't it? But if they're doing the best of what with what they have, it's not quite the same thing as, wretched and all. A new interdenominational missionary project for these Andean Indians is being conducted at Picoqui, something north of Quito. It is similar to a very fine mission, work that has been carried on for a generation by the Canadian Baptist Mission among the Indians on the Bolivian shores of Lake Titicaca. This comprehensive work combines evangelism through its churches, education through its primary schools, medical work through its clinics, and agricultural work through its farms directed by a missionary trained for that purpose among poverty-stricken, oppressed, and illiterate people. This community approach to missions is important if we desire lasting results. Its greatest danger lies in the fact that the social service and educational features may tend to push evangelism to a place of minor importance. Under proper leadership, however, the supreme ministry of preaching and the establishment of New Testament churches can be kept dominant. Well, let's remember church comes from Hero Shrine, and if they're worshiping Jesus, it is a New Testament church. In 1942, Dr. J. L. Hart, pioneer missionary to Argentina and Chile, made a survey of Ecuador and reported encouraging possibilities. I hope and pray that sometime we may be able to open work in Ecuador. We would very soon have a flourishing work. 7 years later, in 1949, Dr. Schweinsberg made another survey and almost lost his life in the attempt. I had bought my ticket from Quito to Ambato, he wrote, but while on the train, the conductor convinced me that I should go on to Cuenca, a university center. 10 minutes before the train reached Ambato, I decided to accept his advice and changed my ticket. Words missing. Next day, the city of Ambato was completely destroyed by a disastrous earthquake. Reverend A. Jensen of the well-known evangelical radio station, the Voice of the Andes, made a special trip down from Quito to see if he could find my body among the ruins. Dr. Schweinberg re-emphasized a need and opportunity in Ecuador where none of the older evangelical denominations had been engaged in missionary undertaking. Southern Baptists have responded to the challenge through their advance program, and in 1950, Reverend and Mrs. W. M. Haverfield and Reverend and Mrs. Gordon Crocker were appointed as missionaries to Ecuador, with headquarters in Quito, Peru, land of the Inca. Flying across an island-studded bay 100 miles south of Guayaquil, the air traveler obtains his first glimpse of Peru, a giant republic whose area approximates that of all our southeastern states. So they include Texas in that. Maps make things hard to tell because of distortion sometimes. The dry, narrow coastal plain is backed by the lofty Andes, which cover most of the country. On the other side of the mountains, in the northeast, the country is drained by great streams that flow into the Amazon. In the southeast, between Peru and Bolivia, is Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in the world, 12,000 feet above sea level. In the places where it is irrigated, the coastal plain produces excellent sugar and some of the finest cotton in the world. Though Peru has large mineral deposits, farming is the chief occupation of the 7 million inhabitants, the overwhelming majority of whom are of Indian extraction. And by that they mean Native American. The soaring plain rounds Point Parina, South America's westernmost tip, which nevertheless lies east of Key West, Florida, and then follows the coast of Peru southward. It is a rainless region made habitable in spots by occasional rivers which empty into the Pacific. Hour after hour, the flight follows this awful barren solitude, this vast silent desert, beyond which rises the massive heights of the Andes. Below, like a lonely black serpent, the Pan-American Highway winds about the contours of brown sand hills and skirts the shores of the blue Pacific. Along that same route, over 400 years ago, the intrepid Spanish conqueror, Francisco Pizarro, rode with his little army of 183 men and 37 horses to subdue an empire 600 miles beyond Point Parina. Green, irrigated fields tell the traveler that he is nearing civilization. Well, that's actually proof of civilization right there. Suddenly, like a beautiful mirage, Peru's gleaming capital, Lima, rises from the plain. Founded in 1535 by Pizarro, Lima is one of South America's most exquisite cities, with lovely plazas and broad boulevards. Through a Spanish viceroy, appointed directly by the King of Spain, it ruled a vast territory from Ecuador to Chile. With its many imposing churches and monasteries, it was likewise the center of Roman Catholic power, the archbishop ruling from a palace next door to the towering cathedral. Lima also boasts of San Marcos University, founded in 1551, the oldest university in the Western Hemisphere. Lima's families of European descent still determine the destinies of the nation, but the majority of Peru's citizens are Indians of pure or mixed blood, who live in the highlands, tilling little plots of soil or raising herds of llamas and alpacas. In the large cities, small industries are employing many thousands, whose economic lot is much higher than that of the Indian, but this growing middle class is still comparatively small. The historian Prescott, writing in the middle of the last century, has immortalized the Inca civilization, one of the most advanced ever to appear in the Western Hemisphere. Skilled artisans and farmers, adept in terracing and irrigation. The Incas were also a very religious people, whose moral codes often surpassed those of the Spanish invaders. Their deep spiritual perception is revealed in the prayer which they uttered before a golden disk reflecting the rays of the rising sun. O Father, Son, we worship thee as the author of all life and being, and if thou art not the author of all life and being, then we worship the one who created thee. Now, when people do their sun salutations in yoga, a lot of people who do that don't know what the things mean. Now, this isn't actually a translation of any of that, but but hopefully one has a better form of worship than praying to something and then it's like, well, if you're not actually the deity, we worship that instead. It's like, it doesn't quite work that way. I mean, it's closer than just worshiping a creation and then, not throwing in a caveat, but still. In front of the Cathedral of Lima, a huge statue of Pizarro represents the conqueror astride his warhorse. In his face can be seen the marks of daring leadership, fanatical zeal, and bestial cruelty. The crumbling mortal remains of the great captain lie exposed under glass in one of the side chapels of the beautiful cathedral, whose cornerstone he laid. His conquests started in Cajamarca, where the emperor Atahualpa, known as the Inca. Yeah, it's important sometimes to figure out what the actual names of these tribes are. Surrounded by all of his nobles, received his guests courteously and unarmed. After Father Valverde's unsuccessful attempt to convert the emperor publicly, Pizarro and his men drew sword and massacred the company in cold blood, but purposely saved the Inca from harm. As a ransom for his freedom, Atahualpa promised to fill with gold a room 17 feet wide by 22 feet long, as high as he could reach, and an adjoining smaller room with silver. From all over the empire, llama trains brought priceless cups, pitchers, flowers, and figures of gold, and fulfilled the promise of the Inca. To the last ounce of treasure, he was rewarded by the basest perfidy. Pizarro condemned Atahualpa to death for having too many wives. The only limit biblically is if you're a bishop or higher up in the Christian church, then you're only supposed to have one wife. For murdering his brother, an unfounded charge, and for stirring up enmity. And the Bible doesn't even require consent for marriage. I think it should, but it doesn't. So forced marriage was a thing in America until they decided that wasn't, sentenced to be burned at the stake. He was promised that if he chose Roman Catholic baptism, he would only be strangled. He chose the less hideous form of execution, and after his assassination was accorded a spectacular funeral with a solemn high mass said for his soul. Yeah, there should never be forced conversion. It's another thing Islam differs from Christendom with. An insatiable thirst for gold drove Pizarro and his followers to Cuzco, holy capital of the Incas, a city of 400,000 people. There they discovered immense wealth, including the sacred image of the sun made of solid gold. Drunk with gold and conquest, they thought they were secure. But a few years later, an army of 200,000 Inca warriors attacked and kept the Spaniards fighting for their lives for over a year. When finally subdued, the Incas were virtually enslaved, and they died by the thousands in the gold and silver mines of the conquerors. It has been estimated by some historians that within 1 century they were reduced from 25 million free people to 5 million debased slaves. Out of their suffering, Lima waxed rich, and a fifth of all the wealth flowed back to the Spanish crown to build more palaces and gold-encrusted cathedrals. Again, it was an Indian who lighted the torch of independence, Tupac Amaru, in 1769, with an army of 20,000 led a fierce rebellion that lasted 3 long years. When captured, he was cruelly tortured and then executed along with 80,000 other Indians who had dared raise a hand against Spain. But the dawn of freedom was near. Within another generation, the forces of independence under General San Martin entered Lima. Victory is finally assured when Bolivar destroyed the Spanish armies on the plains of Ayacucho. A new Peru is emerging from the old. Revolution and counter-revolution mark its difficult advance. Through the building of her railroads, one of the great engineering feats of the world, Peru was lifted out of her isolationism. Great copper deposits in the Cerro de Pasco, the largest in the world, are being mined. Oil deposits are being drilled. A new day is also dawning for the Indians with the launching of the Indo-American movement to better their lot. This movement is sponsored by liberal-minded and forward-looking men of the Andean republics dedicated to the liberation of these tragic peoples. Yet today, millions of them have no opportunity for education, and the economic level of their existence is still pitifully low. Numerous missionary societies from the United States and Great Britain have been supporting workers in Peru for generations with outstanding educational institutions located in Lima, among them the Methodist Lima High School for Girls and the Colegio Anglo Peruano, supported by the Free Church of Scotland. Other mission boards have representatives working among the Indians, and a few missionaries work in the sparsely populated regions east of the mountains in the upper reaches of the Amazon. To the far south, on the northwestern shores of Lake Titicaca, the Irish Baptist Union, through a few dedicated missionaries, is working patiently in the face of great odds, but the masses have never heard the message of salvation. Well, if they've heard the biblical message from the Catholic churches, no wonder why they stirred up, the ire that they have. All members of evangelical Christian churches number about 55,000, with an estimated interested constituency of 100,000 people. The establishing of a new missionary undertaking will be difficult in Peru, but difficulties have not deterred Baptists from advancing. In other areas, Southern Baptists have finally entered Peru through their first representatives, Reverend and Mrs. M.D. Oates, who moved to Lima in 1950. Here are limitless opportunities for continuous missionary advance, for millions of Peruvians are still in desperate need of the gospel of redemption. And we know gospel comes from God's spell. Of course, spell didn't have some of the connotations that it now does.